Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Aquademia podcast. I'm Sean O'Laughlin, and it's just me today for this episode. We have returning champion Halley Froehlich on to give us an update on what's going on in the world of global climate change and how that relates to seafood here in 2022. But before we get into that, as I always do, I want to remind you to please subscribe to Aquademia wherever you listen to podcasts so you can get every new episode directly downloaded onto your device as soon as it's available. Remember to rate and review the show on whichever platform you listen to us on. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can find us on Twitter. We are at Aquademia Pod, or you can use the contact form at globalseafood.org/podcast. So without any further ado, let's get right into this conversation that I had with Halley, and I will talk to you at the end. Thanks, everyone.
Welcome to the Aquademia podcast.
Our diet is hurting the environment in myriad ways. I mean, we desperately need to eat more seafood.
This is a pioneering industry with a whole lot of people who have really good ideas and a lot of experience and are unafraid.
Aquademia is your go-to podcast for a fresh take on all things seafood.
All right, we have returning champion Dr. Halley Froehlich back on. Oh, Frolic. Has anyone ever called you that? Halley Froehlich?
Yeah, it's definitely, it's apropos. Froehlich in German means happy. So, it's real close to frolicking, you know.
Of all the times I've said your name since we've known each other.
Yeah.
The one time I'm being recorded is when I say it wrong. Halley Froehlich is back. And if you don't know who she is, go back to the beginning of the podcast. Our first few episodes, you'll hear her voice. Halley has been on to talk about both her career pathway before, but also her involvement and expertise with climate change and its relation to food systems, particularly seafood. And so we thought climate change is not something that we've really talked about for a little while. And so we said, hey, maybe we should have Halley come back on because people love to hear her voice and have her give us kind of an update on like what has changed over the last 2 years, 2.5 years. What's new? What's the main focus? What are some of the issues that have come up? And just kind of give us an update on what's going on. So we didn't really make much of a structure for this episode. So I'm going to kind of hand it off to Halley. And I told her just to give us an update and let us know what's going on, what's new in the world of global climate change. I feel like climate change has kind of been, I don't want to say covered up, overshadowed, I guess, when COVID came. Because it obviously became the biggest, the primary issue and main focus for everybody. So, like I said, we haven't heard about it in a while. So what is going on in the world of Halley and in the world of climate change?
Yeah, and those two things intersecting quite a bit these days. So I think, first off, thanks for having me. And I think your timing couldn't be better because there's tons of research that's about to come out in relationship to food and seafood in particular in various sections of both the upcoming IPCC report that's coming out. I was one of the contributing authors on that report. And that's kind of the big entity where a whole bunch of international scientists kind of donate their time to collect and synthesize all the information that we know about various aspects, whether that's the modeling of the actual kind of climate dynamics to the things on repercussions for food and people and systems. I obviously was on that latter half of that contribution. And so that's coming out in a few weeks to highlight some things around global climate change impacts. And my specific contribution was around North America.
So that's one report that's coming out or kind of like a series?
Yeah. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is kind of a series. So it has several forms that come out. I was part of working group 2 because it is just such a massive topic and there's so many different dimensions. They have to split it up, but it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages on the most up-to-date understanding that we have in the scientific community of what's going on with climate change.
And when is that coming out?
That's coming out February 28th, I believe.
Oh, right around the corner.
Right around the corner. Yeah. And it was years and years in the making. I was part of it for about 2 years. But I think the kind of really heavy lead authors and all of them, they start prepping and doing things 4 or 5 years in advance. So it takes a really long time and then they start doing it again. But, and on top of that, the United States is ramping up for their 5th national climate assessment. So I'll be participating in that as well, with a whole bunch of US colleagues looking at impacts of climate change. I'll be focusing on the Southwest, so California, and other reaches in that area.
That's where you are, right?
Yeah, that's where
Yeah.
I meant. So have direct linkage to and very cuts deep in studying those dimensions, and providing information on that as well. So a lot of connections, a lot of stuff happening that's coming out. Happy to highlight that today.
Yeah, for sure. Nice to see the U.S. government doing something again with climate.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of nice.
That's a little relieving for all of us in the science community.
Yeah. To once again have it be at least taken seriously to some extent. Obviously, we can provide continual evidence and organization to that information, but it's really up to policymakers to making those recommendations actually matter, and have that action take hold. So.
For sure. So before we get into some of those updates and some of the findings that we can expect, what's going on with you? You know, we haven't talked to you in over 2 years. I think I think last time we talked to you, I think it was like right at the beginning of the pandemic, right, where we all started working from home. I was still in like a little closet lined with moving blankets before I actually built my home office. It was a while ago. What's going on with you?
Yeah, I mean, surviving, like I think most people, just trying to do the best I can of being a professor. I started my professorial job basically right around the time COVID hit. I had about 6 months of in-person anything at my job. I have yet to teach in person. That's so it's been a bit odd and stressful, and but overall surviving. And I'm expecting a new small Froehlich coming into our lives. So I'm looking forward to that, which gives me, I'm doubling down on the climate change research, because now it's, my daughter who is coming in May, what happens in the future is going to be really impactful to her life. So now there's even kind of more urgency for the kind of work that I do, and outreach and work that I do with policymakers.
Yeah, and congratulations on that. By the way.
Thanks, Sean.
I said it to you off air, but I wanted to make sure that we, officially congratulated you from the Aquademia podcast. So that's very exciting.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I did know about it because I'm connected with you on all social media, so I was very excited, but wanted to make sure that you were comfortable talking about it before I brought it up. So
very, very excited. Yeah, we're about 6 months along, so it's balancing that with focus and research in the climate change realm and all of that, along with COVID-19 and navigating this weird space
time.
that we're in. It's
a really weird time.
Pretty surreal. But I feel pretty lucky. My core family is healthy and all of that. So I've been really fortunate.
And like you said, it gives you kind of a new perspective on the work that you're doing, right? And I think people still think they have this mindset when they think of the impacts of climate change, of it, like people say affecting our future generations. They may be thinking they're like great grandkids, but that's not the case. It's a little more immediate than that. And I think, I'm sure you have a really interesting perspective on that now as you're getting ready to, like you said, bring another little Froehlich into this world. Yeah. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about what's going on. What are some of the updates? What's something that people may not know that they should be aware of at this point?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones is that we're seeing the impacts now. I mean, that's becoming really high confidence in our understanding across looking at all the evidence. And I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, certainly living in California, we've had kind of one after the other of the huge fire seasons kind of rolling through, really disrupting and
feels
devastating.
Like it's been nonstop.
Yeah, it basically has.
Yeah.
Up and down the coast, right? And so we have, and whether that's kind of continual intrusion of saltwater, sea level rise, obviously some continued research on linkages with the strength and frequency of hurricanes, which is still starting to come in focus, right? It's not as solid as we have with sea level rise and linkages to fire, but those things are happening now. And so where our generation is really seeing kind of the outfalls of that. So in the seafood realm, and you brought up COVID, through that, we're starting to see kind of those cracks emerge in real time, and really back up some of the predictive evidence that we have across multiple sources. So, if we're looking at, say, wild capture fisheries, we're seeing, again, in real time right now, fisheries on the move, changing their location, tracking either those thermal gradients that they're more accustomed to, or their prey that they have to follow for that. And that obviously has trickle down effects to the fisheries themselves of trying to follow that, and then how you govern those systems as the reach and access to those resources change over time. And we're seeing it on the West Coast of the United States, we're seeing it on the East Coast, we're seeing it in Europe, and everywhere kind of in between. So the evidence to this is it's really stacking up now and showing kind of a lot of the things that kind of more predictive models or things that we suspected based on general trends are starting to happen now.
I'm curious, because there were a lot of these stories that came out during COVID that were like these like nature reclaiming type stories. You know what I'm talking about? So I'm curious, and I'm not asking about if that's actually happening, because I know the truth, but I'm curious from a public mindset point of view. Have you noticed a shift in people's, and I imagine it would not be in the way that would be preferred, but have you noticed a shift in people's attitudes and mindsets towards global climate change because of COVID? Because maybe they think that, there weren't as many planes for 2 years, so like things have gotten better and all this. Like, what have you noticed in that realm? Because I feel like that psychological side of things is not really something that people talk about. I don't know if that makes any sense, or if you feel.
No, it does. I think people are like, maybe this temporary pause
helped a little bit. Right?
Helped a little bit, yeah. And unfortunately, what we know about carbon emissions and atmospheric dynamics and how climate change actually operates is that a 1 year semi hiatus, because everything didn't immediately come to a stop. There was still transport happening. People still exist. Industrialization is still happening.
Right. It wasn't The Walking Dead where just everything stopped.
Where everything completely stops.
Which,
right.
That's good. We don't really want that either.
No, that is the other extreme of which we do not want. Certainly. But what we know is that, this train is rolling, and some of the evidence, even before COVID hit, in kind of the atmospheric science world, of them actually trying to predict what the long-term trends would be, say, for warming or changes in precipitation or sea level rise, all those components connected to climate change, is that we're seeing that it's, like I said, the ball or the snowball, I guess not snowball, but the ball is already rolling. And so the impacts and the carbon that we've already put into the atmosphere is kind of putting us towards that direction. So 1 year really isn't going to do too much. And actually kind of the carbon emissions tracking that goes on in real time. Nowadays, what we're finding is that blip, that decline is right back up. We're right back up to where we were. So it adds to that kind of annual variability, but it fundamentally doesn't change our trajectory that we're seeing for climate change.
Yeah, and that's what I expected. But I'm just curious if there was after seeing that 1 year kind of break, slight relief on the environment. I'm wondering if people kind of just stopped caring.
I almost think it and this is beyond my
people
realm.
Didn't care in the first place anyways.
Yeah, I think and I think people feel overwhelmed. Climate grief is real, right? Especially for earlier generations. Just this morning, I was listening to NPR, and they featured some of that research of just the kind of younger generations they're scared, and already feeling exhausted and overwhelmed. And that does have a psychological effect on your ability to kind of take in information and operate in the world and care about something.
Yeah.
But I also think kind of that COVID dimension of, oh man, COVID, it's heavy. I mean, millions of people dying because of this virus that we can't see, but is global. I mean, there's a lot of parallels there to what we're seeing actually playing out in the dynamics of COVID and science myths and disinformation. Things that are happening right now with COVID are, I mean, that's been happening with climate change for decades, right?
Right.
So
Yep.
there's actually lots of parallels with how people kind of are, I think, absorbing information, at least based on the research, the psychologists that study this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
There's a
yeah.
lot of parallels there, I think.
Interesting. Have you seen a change in your ability to do your research because of COVID? Like, did you get like a lack of resources due to it because there was so much shift in money and other sources?
It definitely, yeah, it upended a lot.
Yeah.
We had to pivot quite a bit for some of the active research we were doing. We had these grandiose plans, and a lot of my colleagues the same, of, we're going to do these interactive workshops. We're going to go out and collect data.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to, run some experiment in a lab and all of these things. And COVID absolutely just
Pulled that
put a
rug
giant,
out.
a giant halt on it. It didn't stop completely. And I was really fortunate because half of what I do is work with electronic fish, right? I model things, use synthesis science to aggregate information to then inform some of the work that I do. So I could lean a bit more heavily on that side of my research, which I was very thankful for, of being an interdisciplinary scientist to be able to leverage that dimension. But
yeah, for sure. I'm sure not everyone was in that same position as you. So I'm sure some people had a really hard time.
I felt for my basic scientist crews out there that really depend on being able to go out and get in the field or be in a lab where you're in very close proximity to other people. I mean, we saw that play out in both aquaculture and fisheries, right? Of the processing and confined spaces of boats and things like that. All that got disrupted, and we saw the same thing kind of transpire on the science side of tracking and trying to study all this stuff. Inherently gets limited when people can't be next to each other and work with each other on those things. Yeah,
for
so
sure.
Huge disruption.
How did some of those people? How did they pivot? What did they end up doing?
Well, a lot of them kind of focused on research development, grant writing,
the fun stuff, the fun part, yeah.
The really monotonous parts.
Yeah. And you had teaching too. I'm sure some of them were in the situation where they could be teaching as well. So
yeah, exactly. Like we're always kind of doing both, or doing service and teaching and research all simultaneously. You kind of have to be a jack of all trades when you're in academia, and somehow do it all to perfection at 100%. So somehow
of course, that's the expectation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fine. Everything's fine.
You're fine.
Which goes really well when there's a pandemic rolling through. Yeah. So yeah, it was really, and continues to be really hard. And, some of the research that's coming out is really showing the cracks in our institutions as well, of, it disproportionately impacts people of color and women in these institutions, right? Who are already kind of underrepresented in terms of the supports. Yeah. And people with young children, that obviously was a huge one that largely, again, impacts women.
I felt that one.
So I have no doubt that as we move forward and people that are kind of keeping track of this, is that there will be holes, there will be gaps and disruptions. And unfortunately, the science lost during this time is probably going to be pretty substantial because it's impacted people.
And not even just because of COVID, but also just because of like we talked about the governmental structure and the the kind of the lack of respect for that research coming from the top.
Yeah,
I'm sure will be a contributing factor towards that loss of science too, which is just too bad. So this is a really downer episode. Sorry, guys.
I know. I should talk about some of the hopeful things that we're seeing with climate change.
Let's start. Well, let's get into some of the actual the science that you have been doing and the results that we're starting to see. I want to start off with because we are a seafood podcast. You are here to talk about seafood and climate change most of the time, but I want to look at kind of some of the challenges that the seafood industry was facing regarding climate change beforehand, and then some of the challenges that they're facing now, and if those have changed or increased or anything like that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. So, I think pre or post, say, COVID, or as science is emerging on our understanding of climate change impacts, the seafood sector in terms of adaptation, right, and how to adapt more readily and more effectively, going from kind of more coping mechanisms of just reactive responses. When something bad happens, you respond, and that's pretty much how the seafood industry has been operating at large,
Yeah.
and it relatively continues to do so.
And I'll say the seafood industry is very good at that.
Yes.
Like
Right.
they have shown to be very innovative when they need to be.
Yeah, exactly right. So you can respond, but that gets really hard when those frequencies of disturbance kind of up themselves. Like the
Yeah.
frequency gets bigger, the intensity gets stronger, and there's only so much that one system can handle, or one dimension of a seafood sector, right? Especially for kind of the smaller players of small scale fisheries or smaller farms, really are put at a disadvantage here in terms of being able to pivot so quickly. And we see this with COVID. So COVID, again, lots of parallels and information that we can glean from how, say, the fishing and aquaculture industry responded, provides us great insight into kind of what's coming down the path in terms of weaknesses or strengths in certain systems. For instance, we found larger producers that are able to divert or change their supply chain really quickly, right? Okay, well, we can't transport this to China. What are our other options in terms of distribution, right? Large distributors could do that. Larger production systems could do that. The smaller farms, not so much. They had to look inward, right? And so we saw a slight difference.
And those smaller farms, for example, their supply chains, they probably don't even know their supply chain.
Right.
That's the thing.
Right.
The supply chain transparency is a really big thing for these larger corporations that are running huge operations, but these smaller farms, they don't know where their fish is going. They just know they sell it to this guy and he takes care of it.
And it can go, right. And if and they have fewer options, right, to potentially pivot, even if they do know. And so we did see kind of a turn towards more kind of community-based distribution, online access, really uptick to those strains from COVID. That gives us kind of a good insight of, this is the type of thing that we could anticipate to see, or in preparation for, inform a more resilient system of diversifying kind of how you get your product to a different location, what access to kind of ice or other kind of cooling processes or processing stations in general. I mean, you name it, we were able to kind of dig in a little bit. I was fortunate enough to work with a whole bunch of really amazing scientists, both in the United States and internationally, on looking at these parallels of COVID and kind of thinking about management systems and adaptability for climate change. And you do, like you said, the seafood system is really good in many ways at pivoting, but we're able to kind of identify some of those cracks, and supply chains were certainly one of them, like most things, just seafood. But from the climate change perspective, this really does provide some really great insights. And I hate to use the word great in this circumstance, but it gives us context of
interesting insights.
Yeah,
some
interesting,
telling insights.
Yeah, exactly right.
So talk about those. Let's talk about some of those insights and some of the data that you were coming out with.
Yeah, so some of the work directly related to climate change that I've done, I just published a paper and synthesizing as much information as I could about aquaculture and climate change impacts and adaptations. And some of the things that are coming out is that, well, not surprisingly, most of the focus and attention kind of revolves around areas in Asia, where most of the production happens of aquaculture. So that's good. I mean, there's good kind of decent coverage on where production is happening and how we understand it. But we saw kind of disconnects between kind of what is being studied and what we understand in terms of the responses. So in regions in Asia, kind of the number one thing that we're seeing in real time in terms of threats and what we're expecting in the future for adaptation is related to sea level rise. Like that's number one. Flooding, sea level rise, that changes is already threatening that region and is expected more so. And if we look, say in North America, ocean acidification absolutely dominates in North
No, really.
America. And was never mentioned in a place like China, which was really interesting that we have this
Yeah,
kind of.
is that because of like regular weather systems, or what do you think that? What's your idea on that?
So I think part of it is linked to the funding that has been put towards ocean acidification directly in North America. So the U.S.
So it's not that
government,
it's not
as well as
happening; it's that they're not looking at it as much.
potentially, right? Or that it's not as big of a threat as sea level rise. So sea level rise right now, they're seeing it in real time, have to really take action of coastal armoring, movement of those areas and what it means for that industry in low-lying areas in particular on coastlines for saltwater intrusion, because we know that can really disrupt the ability to grow anything when the saltwater
Yeah. Oh,
balance
yeah.
is out of whack. So but one of the kind of other sides of that, the more kind of, well, what do we do about it kind of thing. And from this research, we're seeing that while kind of larger global papers will put forward, well, it's really what the answer is better breeding and genetics. That tends to kind of dominate the global literature. When you look more regionally and locally, it's government, it's governance, it's
Hmm.
management practices, it's more kind of farm local level applications to improve those conditions, to improve adaptation. So some of the research we're seeing is that there's an inherent disconnect between what the high level kind of academics and things are putting
Hmm.
forward of like technology will save us,
Right.
versus no, actually it's the people that will save us, and it's the governance that really will determine how this plays out. And certainly technology will have a role to play, but perhaps we can't put all our eggs in the technology basket to assume that adaptation, that form and that pathway will be the end all, especially for poorer regions that may not have access to that.
Now, do you think that's recognized over there and being implemented, or is it something that like is more of a theoretical thing? Like, hey, this would probably work if you did this, if you took these steps. What do you see any of that happening?
Um, not a lot.
Not a
And
lot. Yeah.
this is actually something, another part of my work, um, both in kind of wild capture and aquaculture. There's kind of little attention given to the planning relative to climate change. Of when
Hmm.
plans are put forward for kind of revisioning what the management strategy will be for these systems, it's very rare that climate change will come into that fold. It's not, it doesn't, it can happen, and it does
Yeah.
happen in some locations, but it's very rare. And it's exceedingly rare for aquaculture to think and have climate change be part of that planning process, which ultimately kind of has this feedback loop of, well, then it will just be continuous coping mechanisms. It will just be reactive, which
Hmm.
again is potentially not the best in terms of
Right.
anticipating what's to come.
Right. And like we mentioned, they are very good at it, but it's like running
Yeah,
on a treadmill, kind of, right?
yeah. It's well, and it's this. Is it better to immediately go from zero to running 20 miles an hour? Right, you're going to get leg cramps. You're going to
Hmm.
get winded really fast. You're going to get side stitches. Like there's repercussions to just going and running at 20 miles an hour versus you slowly work it up, right? And you
Hmm.
build up your tolerance and you build up those abilities to have stronger muscles and greater capacity for breathing. I mean, it's the same thing in adapting to this. If we can do it a little earlier, the pains will be a lot worse, right? It will be a lot less expensive. You'll
Yeah.
be able to weather those shocks a lot easier when they're coming down the pipeline. If you are considering kind of location or monitoring, or what the kind of access is to funds to recover from when it does overwhelm you, even if you put strategies into place to weather it.
Yeah.
And again, we saw that with COVID-19, a lot of parallels there.
Yeah. Fantastic analogy. So, okay, we talked about sea level rise, we talked about ocean acidification, we talked about wildfires, all of the happy things. Um, What about changes in weather systems? More extreme storms, the swinging temperatures during different seasons. Has that increased since we last talked to you in the last couple years ago? Have we seen shifts in kind of the weather patterns? Because I know from a person sitting on a couch watching the news, it feels like it's gotten worse.
Sure.
Is that because we're spending more time at home sitting on the couch watching the news? Or is that because the weather systems and these events are getting more frequent? What do you think?
Yeah. So what the science is showing is that there hasn't been a dramatic, say, uptick in the last year or so, right? But the trend is increasing towards kind of changes in more intense precipitation events and longer dry periods that occur. And you get these more massive swings, right? And that has been starting to precipitate and happen over the last couple decades, right? Not just within a year. These are long climatic changes that are obviously linked to weather, but weather is that variability that bounces around the overall average of that climate changing long term. But I think you nailed something. Is that a lot of people are at home on their phones, on their computers, kind of absorbing some of this doom scrolling information more readily, perhaps. We're also, getting better at linking these systems together, of having more confidence in the science of continual testing. Even though COVID was happening, as scientists, we're still at it, trying to do our best to work on it and contribute, even though we're not all immunologists and trying to find the, the solution and vaccines for COVID. We were doing our best to try to continue to contribute to climate change research. So I would say the science continues to get stronger. The evidence gets stronger for those connections as well. And I would say the media itself is also becoming a bit more receptive of reporting on these things.
Some medias.
Some medias, certainly not all.
Certainly not all of them.
Yeah, but there was more coverage of climate-based aspects in the media last year than there had been the year before that, right? So I think there's also an uptick in recognition that, actually the scientists may be onto something here, and reporting on it. So I think it's kind of maybe a mix of all of these factors to really bear down and witness what's going on. Because when COVID, I think you were right. When COVID wasn't here, we could get caught up more easily in our daily lives and not necessarily forced to sit in our house and just think in silence or to consume information, for better or worse sometimes. So, which, is heartening to see when people are getting this information, or especially younger generations are feeling kind of inspired to take that path of wanting to see change, of recognizing that there's pretty solid evidence here, and even for how young they are, that they see kind of the importance of that and what that means for them, for their life moving forward.
That's amazing to watch, because I'm I'm in my mid-30s now, so I'm getting to that age where I'm starting to see the separation between the younger generation and my own generation. And I'm on the TikTok. I don't
even have that. So
I went on there. I'm on there. I don't contribute. I'm a consumer. But there's something to be said for algorithms and those kind of things, and they show you what you want to see. So it is definitely biased, but the amount that I see the younger generations really not just being aware, but like caring about it and trying to be more actionable about this climate change in particular, I see a lot of too, and it's encouraging to me. Which it's nice to see, because growing up in our generation, we didn't see a lot of that. It was kind of suppressed, and we were almost the people who are our age who kind of like pushed that.
Yeah,
it was like an uphill battle for us. So it's nice to see the younger generation being kind of flipped, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think reports like IPCC and these international kind of consortiums coming together to really convey that information or message. I mean, it's at that point where it's irrefutable that this is happening, and that it is going to have deep and lasting consequences for society and nature. And to your point, much of that was suppressed or ignored. as we were growing up. And so, we didn't learn about climate change when we were in elementary school and high school. It wasn't until I got to college.
So, yeah, but it's the benefit of them being younger and choosing to not listen to older people. I think that's been beneficial. So that's a whole different topic that I'm not qualified to have. So
Same.
but I just thought that was interesting how you kind of see a shift in the generational viewpoint of it.
It's much
Earlier in this conversation, you mentioned positives.
Yeah.
There's some good news. Let's talk about some of the good things, because we have been kind of doomsday. Let's get into some good.
It's climate change and COVID kind of do that to conversations.
Yeah, for sure.
So one big thing overall that's coming into light is that some of the climate policies that have been put into place are working. So that kind of worst case scenarios of 4 degrees increase, for instance, is not looking like that's going to be our future. That's huge, right?
That's huge.
That's huge, right?
Yeah.
It means that policy is really critical here, as my research showed in aquaculture as well, of that policy dimensions and interventions work. And it's just a matter of, are people willing to adopt those things for those changes? But that has been a really important finding of that kind of long-term worst case scenario is not proving or likely going to play out, given the trajectory of those policies and how energy is shifting in terms of that trajectory as well. And I had some colleagues recently publish a paper on really exploring and disentangling why it is we're seeing that, while it is going to warm and we're very much on the trajectory of kind of that 2 to 3 mark degree Celsius. So that is still happening, and that still does result in dramatic impact. It isn't that 4 to 5 degree in previous decades of study that we had modeling out, and that yes, we can intervene, right? It is not too late. There isn't this impending tipping point in 5 or 10 years where we can't do something about it. We absolutely can, and that is emboldening. That's exciting. And I think the thing that can easily get lost in the doom and gloom of just feeling overwhelmed and not being able to do something, but no, we can, and we actually have the tools to do it. That's the other cool part of, we know that certain policies that are put into place for better regulations over carbon emissions, whether certainly at the industrial level of companies doing that, but also at kind of local scales and applications of, say, home development, right? Of inducing or putting in actions to reduce household gas use and electrifying things and solar panel incentives and those types of things work and have been working, which is really exciting. So that's all very positive. And things like the Build Back Better plan that the Biden administration has tried to put forward had so much in it in terms of climate, and it looks like there is still potential there to kind of weave some of those things in.
Sneak some of that stuff in.
Which is really, really great. So we see that's playing out in the global stage of those initiatives have really positive repercussions. And then if we're looking at the seafood side, there's tons of excitement over the prospects of diversifying the kind of portfolio of the types of things that are grown. So seaweeds are having their day in the light. People are so excited about seaweeds. And while they will not save us from climate change, and I can't emphasize that enough, as much as I love seaweeds, they are not the silver bullet to what ails us for climate change. That is, we have to reduce carbon emissions. That's the end point.
Yeah, there's no real, one thing that can fix it anyway. So
this is going to be. There's no silver bullet. It's more of a casting, right? It's more of a shotgun approach. You need a little bit of everything. Some things will have bigger impact than others. But for seaweeds and kind of lower unfed species like oysters and other bivalves, right? Yep, exactly. That those types of taxonomic groups are showing real promise for improving water quality, seaweeds, buffering the effects, at least locally, at smaller scales of hypoxia, so low oxygen conditions, as well as ocean acidification. So planning those types of things for integrating into a system could be really beneficial for buffering some of the effects coming down the pipeline that, again, the ball's already kind of rolling, but there are things and interventions that could be put into place that could help mitigate some of those impacts moving forward directly in the aquaculture industry and working alongside fisheries as well. So that there are these like nature-based solutions that are there that are getting people really excited. That is always really cool to see.
It's always nice when you realize that something is not as bad as you thought it was. That's I wanted to talk about fisheries. I know a lot of your work is revolving around aquaculture, but
yes.
What are some of the biggest challenges that the fisheries are facing right now? Is that mostly like moving stocks because of temperature changes, things like that? Regulations that they have to face because now they're in different areas? What do you think are what is affecting the wild caught fisheries?
Some of the biggest things that we're noticing, certainly, and I'll focus on the United States because those are the ones that I know well, really well. And I'll try to branch out a little bit when talking about forage fish. But some of the things that we're finding that are really hitting the industry hard are things like harmful algal blooms. That's a big one. So that took a huge chunk out of the timing for, say, the Dungeness crab fishery here on the West Coast. One of the most lucrative and important fisheries that we have has been just repeatedly hit by harmful algal blooms that causes the fishery to have to shut down early or delay that season or eliminate it completely. And because of this, as one capacity, there's another dimension here, but one part of this actually led to that industry suing oil producers for the first time in history.
Wow.
Because of that interaction, because they linked climate change to their losses, right? To their well-being, to their livelihoods. And that's the first time we've seen that happen.
Yeah, I didn't hear about that. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And it really this is something that I see time and time again is either fishers or aquatic farmers, like these people are on the front lines. I've had almost no interaction where any farmer or fisher has said to me, well, climate change doesn't matter, or climate change isn't real. That has never come out of the mouth of a fisher or farmer that I've interacted with. Doesn't mean that it's not the case, but these people are like, oh, no, yeah, we see this all the time. Like ocean acidification ripped through, killed all our larvae, the giant heat wave wiped out our mussels, right? So these things are just, they're right there seeing it firsthand as these things become more common. So in addition to kind of delaying seasons or completely eliminating it, is also changing the dynamics, as you were saying, kind of species on the move, moving different locations, either the targeted species themselves, or in the case of both the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States, the kind of phytoplankton, zooplankton are moving.
The food species.
The food, the source, the bottom of the food chain is moving. And the big things that follow those things, whales, are also moving. Moving away from those areas into areas that are heavily fished, right? And now you have this ecosystem conflict that is starting to emerge as well. So we have these layers of climate change impacts kind of unraveling, where even if it doesn't dramatically directly affect the organism at hand, you have these other effects playing out that will. And so we're seeing that play out as well. And then layered on top of that is the governance dimension of, fish and invertebrates don't care, the ones that move and follow the prey or follow the temperature gradient. They don't know our boundaries. They don't know our geographic or governance boundaries. And so you have lobsters and other species moving into other states, moving into other countries, which create a lot of challenges and quote unquote fish wars that are playing out in current state of things. And there's tons of research of fishery scientists who are kind of studying, how best do we move forward on this? How can you prepare and our anticipation? Because not all stocks are moving, but
Mhm.
enough are that it's creating issues, especially when they're the really high value ones like
Right.
crabs and lobsters.
And like the people who fish for those, that's what they do. It's not like they're going out and catching whatever they can catch, right? Like
That's right.
you're targeting this one species, and that species happens to now be in Canadian waters. You don't where you don't have the rights
What do
to
you
fish
do?
in.
Right.
What do you do? You
That's
know,
right.
and that
What do you do?
but it's also like, well, that's not my fault. I now all of a sudden it's either fish illegally or die until someone or starve. You know,
Or
so,
switch, right? Like that.
right.
That's a really cool dimension that a lot of my work is starting to intersect with, of the interactions between fisheries and aquaculture. Some of my postdocs and graduate students, they're looking at these blue transitions of what happens when, say, fisheries decline, either through, say, overfishing or changes in where fish are,
Mhm.
whatever that mechanism is, to see that decline. Do we see the emergence of aquaculture on the other side,
Yeah,
as
we've talked
well?
about that.
Yeah.
We had an episode talking about scallops, and we were talking about how lobstermen on and this is more kind of on the off season, right? Like not so much because they're forced to, but
Right.
they're starting to farm scallops on their off season so they can have income coming in all year, and like
All
that's
year
like
round. Yeah.
that's an option. Okay, well I can't fish for this species anymore, but while I'm here, I can get a couple acres, lease a couple acres, and farm some shellfish because
Yep.
that's an option here, and that's there's a legitimate economy for it, and so yeah, that's really interesting too. And that actually leads right into kind of the last thing I was going to ask you, because actually this time got away from us. We've all been doing this for almost an hour already.
Yep.
What can our listeners? What are some actions that our listeners could take? You know who our audience is. It's the seafood. It's the people in the seafood industry, from
Seafood
all the way
industry.
from
Yeah.
executive at distributors all the way down to the people who are producing and making feed and all this different every facet of the seafood industry. What can those people do to either adapt or help the situation?
Yeah. Well, there's a multitude, but I'll go back to some of the research that was that we talked about in the beginning, which is that governance dimension, the policy dimension. And
Yeah.
I tell this across the board to students or anybody in between, farmers, you name it. Like the number one thing, especially when it comes to climate change and adaptations and finding solutions, is to vote. I mean, you could change your diet. You could, buy more advanced technology to do precision farming, right? Which would be really helpful for an individual, but as a collective, right? The collective action when it comes to climate change and seafood, or climate change and just society in general, voting is the absolute most powerful thing you can do to really help collectively push that needle in a direction to have more infrastructure that collectively benefits everybody. And certainly, like I said, that's not the end all technology, and selective breeding practices and siting and all of that.
Yeah.
Those other individual and very seafood specific approaches, very useful. But if the infrastructure, the policy and governance is missing, it's exceedingly hard to do that. Not impossible, but it makes it much more challenging to try to get that and get the returns on investment, right? Of, wouldn't it be great that there would be incentives or tax breaks if the growing seaweed allowed you to have those, right?
Yeah.
That's a policy thing that would need to happen, and people are really excited about growing those things and advancing that dimension, but the policy hasn't caught up to that innovation yet,
Right.
and so that would be my big one.
That's fantastic. And you know what? That's similar to the advice that you gave last time you were on too.
It is. It's like I'm consistent sometimes.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to know that you know.
Uh,
This has been fantastic. Thank you so much again for coming on. Is there anything else that you want to get out there? I want to say I really appreciate the fact that every time I ask you a question or ask you to share your knowledge, you start off by saying, I'm going to reference the research. And you're relying on the actual science that's been done and has been published. And I really Appreciate that. It's a breath of fresh air when we're surrounded by all of the doom scrolling with people who think that they know what's going on, but actually don't know the research and the science. And it's nice that is where you always come from, and I appreciate that. But before we go, any other message that you want to get out there before we close things out here? And I'm sure we'll have you on again because, you're, like I said, returning champion. So this is not your last opportunity to speak, but I want to make sure I give you the floor to get out anything you want to get out.
Yeah, I guess I would just reiterate, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the advanced and eminent things that are coming down the pipeline with climate change, but really kind of the hope is not lost on this. And we do have the tools and we do have the knowledge in terms of how do we get through this in a way that benefits the local farmer or the fisher, upwards of the greater coastal communities and beyond. That there is not hope is not lost, and I can't say that enough because it's so easy to just get stuck in it as we weaved through that depressing diatribe in the beginning of our conversation. That's a prime example of it's really easy to get stuck in the negative, but there is hope, and one of the things for the reports that are coming out for IPCC and for the National Climate Assessment is a greater emphasis on adaptation and solutions. That we've shown that impacts are coming, but so are the solutions too, and hope is not lost.
That's perfect. Thank you. And then lastly, if anyone wants to get in contact with you, would you like that? And what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I get about 50 emails a day, so if I do not respond, don't take it as a personal attack. But yes. Obviously, my email is available. If it's aquaculture or seafood related or related to my research, I'm happy to answer those questions.
Awesome. Well, that makes me feel a lot better about how quickly you answered my email when I reached out to you. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Awesome. So again, Halley Froehlich, we really appreciate you joining us, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sean.
Folks, that was my conversation with Halley Froehlich all about what is going on with global climate change in 2022. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I hope you will reach out to us by using that contact form at globalseafood.org/podcast. Remember to subscribe to Aquademia wherever you listen and leave us a rating and review on whichever platform you use. We would love to hear from you. And with that, thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.